we have to look at this visit of the Indian Premier coming in relation to as to how we can drive exports and tourism with sheer precision that can protect the SME sector. So I see I'm not getting into the war of align or non-align. I'm looking at a more practical dimensions of how do we arrive at a partnership, how do you make sure that we have 10 exporters identified in terms of driving the Indian market. I'm not looking at 100, 10, because right now there's only 14 guys going. It's just a handful. So unless there is some concrete discussion that's going to happen post this, as somebody said here that, maybe this was such a hurried visit that, people had not yet really had bilateral pre-discussions. But I think now the post-discussion, if it doesn't happen, we have lost this window. And if we lose this window, we'll have to go after, a country which is 25,000 miles away, and there's also going to be new tariffs coming in from there, which we don't know actually today. Tomorrow morning when we get up only we'll realize whether the US tariff is coming to place.
So Dr. Rohantha, what you're saying is the fact that we need to have somewhat of a closer relationship or an alignment to a global plan that a certain group of countries or certain big players in the global geopolitics have. That does not necessarily mean that we are completely alienating the other countries, but we must align ourselves with the broader global plan of one of the bigger players. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I mean, you take, for example, in 1990, Bangladesh, Vietnam and Sri Lanka all were at $4 billion in our exports. Today, because Vietnam has linked himself with a particular economy in the West, so has Bangladesh. Today, Bangladesh is at 53 billion. Vietnam is at about $320 billion.
They're growing at about 40 billion a year.
And Sri Lanka is at 16.7 billion. So, to me, that's the cost of the war, because your focus was totally on something else. So, but now we've got a chance to look at India. And since India has helped us, we have to pay them that $4 billion back, which they gave us in 2023. I think we need to barter and strike a deal. Even if it's not cash driven, it should be export driven.
So Shakthi, how do you respond to it just before we go in?
Sure. So this is exactly why I try to clarify the terms. If you're talking about alignment, alignment implies that you have complete political allegiance to one country at the expense of the other, or you sign a military agreement. Now what Dr. Athukorala mentioned falls within the ambit of non-alignment. You can ride the Indian wave, which is something I've been saying for quite a while, in terms of expanding our trade relationship, even considering ETCA, provided that it provides us benefits. Now that doesn't mean we are alienating anyone else.
If I pose the question to you, then let's leave the jargon aside. Let's leave non-alignment aside. If I pose the question to you now, it's not a bipolar world. It's a multipolar world. There are several big players, and each of these big players has a grand plan for how the world should turn out. Are you for or against Sri Lanka choosing to join this grand plan of one of these big players in the world? Are you against it or for it?
When you're saying joining a grand plan, we are already part of several grand plans. We are part of the Belt and Road
We're part
Initiative.
of several grand plans.
Exactly, which is possible through a non-alignment.
So are you saying that having 5% in A's grand plan and 5% in B's and 6% in C's and so on and so forth, having just a small stake in all of those grand plans is more beneficial to Sri Lanka than, putting our foot down and saying, look, we believe in your plan, we believe in this, and maybe investing 50% in A's and leaving the remaining 50 for maybe C, D, E, F, whoever.
Okay, so firstly, that's not exactly how international relations play out. In terms of our engagement, we believe in all of the plans, which is why Sri Lanka is actively engaging in all of them, right?
So I think Nilanthan's concern was the fact that that's borderline hedging.
I mean, that we stand for nothing by pretending to stand for everything. We stand for nothing, and we have no real strategic allies who can actually help us in a pinch unless they want to. That's my concern.
Okay, so again, in my perspective, that's rather myopic, because if we look at our history, Sri Lanka is riven with cases where we aligned with one country expecting benefits and those benefits didn't materialize. You can go back to the 1980s to find several examples of Sri Lanka tilting towards one side expecting benefits. When those benefits didn't materialize, the other side took sort of vengeance on us, in a sense, right? So, to answer your question, we are not hedging, and I have problems with the term hedging also because you need to clarify the terms. It's important to clarify what hedging means. But leaving that aside, we believe in each of the plans, which is why we are part of them. We should ideally ride the Indian wave. And in terms of riding the Indian wave, I agree with Dr. Athukorala, there are several areas that need to be expanded on in terms of our export trade, in terms of our investment, which is a fraction of the total investment that India is spending across the world. We really need to attract that. In terms of trade, we need to, as I mentioned earlier, we need to bring in the South Indian states to invest in Sri Lanka as well. These are necessary factors that the Sri Lankan government need to look into. Now, that doesn't mean we are going to say to the Chinese we're getting out of the BRI because India doesn't sign on to the BRI, so BRI is out of the question. That's political allegiance. I'm saying we shouldn't naturally align ourselves politically with only one side at the expense of the other. So, I am confused at what Nilanthan says when he says we need to abandon non-alignment, because what he says sounds a lot like non-alignment in a sense by the definition that I provided, right? Because non-alignment implies that we are not signing on to a military agreement and we are not giving our political allegiance to one country at the expense of the other. So if Nilanthan agrees with that, then that would be non-alignment.
So if we're going to go with the definition of non-alignment as you need to have a NATO, if not you're non-aligned, okay, I mean, I am just advocating for common sense. If you want to call that non-alignment, then go ahead and call it non-alignment, right? But my issue was regarding what you brought up rightly, Shalan, which is whose grand vision are we a part of? Is this going to be a picnic table where we say 10% for BRI, 10% for Sagar, 10% for a rules-based world order? Because all of them know our game at this point. All the major powers right now know what big flip-floppers we are, right? And even in terms of the revenge thing of the 80s and all that, now we've never been aligned over the course of one political party. Whenever the UNP comes in, we had one alignment, and when the SLFP came in, we had another alignment. So it's not like we've ever given alignment a try. You can't just call one term aligning yourself with one country and then swapping sides once a new person comes. You can't really call that alignment and then say alignment has been a failure here. So I mean, I'm not in favor of some kind of South Asian NATO. So I guess I'm a follower of non-alignment at the moment. As long as we have a strategic vision, as long as we know what our place in the world is, I don't really care what we call it, as long as it's a common sense foreign policy. So if we want to call it that, we can call it that. I don't have a problem with it.
Can I just bring this back to our economic reality? Dr. Rohantha, in 2022, when we fell flat on our faces because of our own idiotic decisions in this country, we didn't get a lot of countries rushing to help us, which, I mean, in some ways it was surprising because we were supposed to be this friend to everyone, smiling at all the countries basically, but we didn't get a lot of help when we were really down and out. And finally India did step in. You know, that's the economic reality. We had messed it up so badly. But again, you don't see this kind of issue happening with many countries which, if you want to call it, are more economically aligned. Because, you know, when you are economically aligned with a certain bloc, that bloc of countries has an interest in keeping you afloat. Let's look at Greece, part of the EU, but a very weak economy within the EU when you look at Germany and France and all that. But when they went bankrupt, the EU consciously, I mean, there was no doubt about it, they stepped in, they helped, and so on. So that alignment, economic alignment, certainly helped over there. We didn't have anything like that. We were sort of looking around saying, anybody, you know, sort of like a hitchhiker on the highway going, you know, can I get a ride? and vehicles weren't stopping.
Yeah, I mean, we got to look at it. It all depends about, you know, how this game of demand supply equates. If your supply chains are very important to a given demand chain, then obviously there are people who are going to support you because it's going to impact them. So we supply almost like what, $5 billion worth of apparel into US, but the question is that, I mean, we are like below 2% of their total share of imports, so we are small, you know. So we have to understand that, Nilesh, and at this given moment of time, for whatever reason, the whole of South Asia is in absolute turmoil. It's in turmoil. I mean, Bangladesh was doing good, but now they are severely challenged. You know that Maldives is, I mean, they have to pay something like 1 billion by 2026, and they don't have that funds coming in. They are impending a hit on financially, right? Pakistan is in trouble and has been in trouble. We don't see it coming out. So in this backdrop, I mean, for us to be growing at about a 5.3% is fantastic, but then, you know, our economic linkages are not there with India. So even though we have a daily flight from Palale, we have something like 84 flights out of BIA airport and India and back on a weekly basis. There is going to be now the ferry service which is activating. So with so much of logistical linkage, if we don't have some degree of economic linkage, where we are so important that India cannot work without us, you know, if we don't come to that, we are not going to be actually can be a 7% GDP growth economy. We cannot, and we have to keep in mind that our expenditure is 7.2 trillion rupees, and what is our income? 4.9 trillion. So we are going on taking loans from the private sector. $1 trillion was taken in January through different financial instruments to keep the government going. Now we can't go on like this. So I think we need to forget those global forces that are in place, and we got to be real in saying, how do we make sure that we can protect the SME sector? I don't know whether you know this, Niresh, but only 44% of households, their income covers the monthly expenditure. It was 7% in July, and then it became last year. In September it became 20%. By December, PepperCube research data shows that it's only 44%, which means 56% of the people are dwelling into their savings, and that's why every town you get a pawning center. So
this is by this month or last year? Or?
December.
By December.
December data.
So must have improved a little bit, maybe.
The latest data, Shalan, was that it was tanking.
It was tanking?
Yeah, because the cost of living had gone up. So we have a challenge here. We know that there is a challenge.
But inflation has gone down.
Yeah, it depends on the basket of goods that you buy and how you calculate inflation. You know what I'm saying? So it's strange. I mean, every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, if you were to want to go to a restaurant, you can't get. So what is that? That is that 44% who is traveling around, and we look at that and say Sri Lanka is bouncing back. But you can see, if you look at the consumption of yogurt, if you look at the consumption of soaps, you can see 65% of households have moved away from it, and they're going back to basics. So what I'm saying is that I think we need to get real. We know that our expenditure is more than income, and if we go like this, 100% sure we'll have to go for the 18th time to IMF for a bailout, because our expenditure is more than our income. So now you know that the SMEs are in trouble, right, and they contribute to 52% of the economy. If we don't use this visit to get our supply chain on the two sectors, I'm not looking at FDIs, exports and tourism, and if we can get the proper set of Indians to come in, and for that someone said this, we need to have a global marketing strategy also in place. I mean, we can't just go and say come to Sri Lanka. We got to have a good campaign.
We can't say come to Sri Lanka to the Indian government. We need to take that to our customers.
The last time a global advertising campaign took place was 11 years back.
Wasn't it the So Sri Lankan campaign?
See, it wasn't a
That's a
multimedia campaign. See, you need to have TV, radio, press, plus digital, plus influencers, plus endorsers coming in. Now, for example, if you take Maldives, one company that I sit in, we do the total AI-based strategy for Maldives tourism and the partners there. They use about 23 elements of the marketing communication mix to bring in the tourists to Maldives. So what happens is there's one guy, a Sri Lankan employed. His job is to go and get the top celebrities to come to Maldives. Sri Lankan. So we need to have multi strategy, and I think the Sri Lanka right now we are beautifully poised because end of the day the government is 100% governance driven, and because of that it's easy to run tenders. Nobody is going to go and say I need some kickback on it. So I think this chance we should not allow to lose on the tourism front. At the same time, we got to ask India how that integration can happen so that we can cover our trade deficit. I mean, end of the day, tourism can be a $8 billion business. Exports can be a 26 billion business. And if you do this, within 3 years, you can cover your debt.
Share, I think.
Yeah. I was trying to ask this question Nilanthan for a long time. Nilanthan, one of the key topics between the two neighbors is the security concerns, national security. Now, there is a clause, it seems like, there's a rumor, I don't know whether it's true, with the 1987 Indo-Lanka Accord, Sri Lanka basically has to kind of be open and inform Indian government if there is going to be any ships or warships or coming to Sri Lanka, and this is seen by some other countries that it's an infringement of Sri Lanka's sovereignty in decision making, right? Could you elaborate on that? I mean, and also we have seen like the research ship, the issue of the research ship, Chinese research ship coming to Sri Lanka is seen as a security threat by India, and they lodged complaint with Sri Lanka Foreign Ministry, and then the government basically stopped it for 1 year temporarily, and now they have again started. Can you elaborate on what's the real concern on the national security?
Sure. So if we would take the research ship issue for instance, now this is the problem with dual use technology, which is that the same ship with the same equipment, you can either pass it off as a general research vessel, but that can also be used for surveillance. So that's the problem. So even if these guys have a genuine intent on just basic civilian research, the fact that this technology could be used for surveillance and mapping the seabeds and all that will naturally be seen as a security threat. So that's the major problem here. Now, in terms of the other issue that you brought up, so I would say that both India and Sri Lanka, thankfully, both seem to be under the impression that this is a new world, it's a new Sri Lanka, it's a new India, and therefore we need to work together on a new framework and metrics. And I think that's a good thing, because one of our major problems is that because there's no formal defense cooperation framework here, security and defense just becomes hostage to local politics. This is why countries sign defense cooperation agreements in the first place. There are more than 2,000 defense cooperation agreements that are signed all over the world. The reason countries sign it is because most countries agree that defense and security cannot be the prisoner of local politics. So hopefully, even though right now what we are signing with them is very basic stuff like them giving us some technological platforms and for maritime surveillance platforms and formalizing some of these joint training ventures and all that, I personally see it as a step in the right direction towards formalizing some norms, some security norms in the region. As Dr. Athukorala pointed out, South Asia is a complete mess at the moment. You have Pakistan and Afghanistan on the verge of war. You have Myanmar on the verge of complete collapse with all the insurgent groups now forming into one coalition. Right, you have countries like the Maldives, which took up a very fiercely anti-Indian position, and now they've realized that they can't survive with that, so they have to keep jetting back and forth from Maldives to New Delhi to kind of make amends. So the entire thing is a bit of a mess at the moment. The more formalized, standardized agreements we have, the better we can insulate our own security and defense decisions from local politics in every country. I mean, even if we look at the basic issues like the fisheries issue and the Kachetevi issue and anything that you bring up, all of that, to solve any of that, we need some kind of formalized framework. And I see that as a step in the right direction. I think both countries agree that commitments in the 80s and all that are not going to be viable moving into the future. They might pay lip service to stuff like that, but there's a deep understanding among the strategic communities in both countries that a new way forward is what's needed, not going back into commitments.
So based on that, what do you expect to be in the defense cooperation between the two countries?
So number one, I hope that these technology transfers continue, because we do need to modernize our armed forces and we don't have the resources to do that. The ultimate end goal for our own interests is creating an indigenous defense sector here, for which we need joint ventures from India. For a long time, we've tried to create our own military tech. We've tried to create our own research and development frameworks and all that. None of it has actually worked, because you need expertise from someone who actually has experience in this, and you need joint ventures to come in. So ultimately, the confidence of a proper structure will allow many companies in India to set up joint partnerships here, because Sri Lanka's future is in having our own indigenous capacity and some kind of domestic industry for these things. And for that, we need Indian companies to work hand in hand with us, at least during the initial stages. This is how it basically happens. And even for energy security, my God, I mean, just look at how vulnerable we are to global energy crisis.
Monkeys.
Yeah, I mean, in 2022, even though internal problems is what caused it, there was also the global energy crisis of 2022, where energy prices shot up and many countries were in our position where they simply couldn't afford to buy the energy they were buying. So us being able to generate our own energy, us being able to digitize our economy by leveraging India's expertise in e-governance and all that, all of these fix very fundamental strategic problems that we have today. And that's the direction that we need to move in. Common sense wise, that, like I said, we are 9 months pregnant. At some point of time, someone has to take a decision to conduct the surgery. So hopefully at least that comes out of these MOUs.
And what about the energy security? I mean, India has been basically, coming to Sri Lanka and advising for several energy projects. It could be Adani, it could be some other renewable energy projects in the north, and then some solar power project. Now Sampur is they are going to groundbreaking ceremony on Sampur on 5th, right? So why is it critical for India to arm Sri Lanka's energy security?
I mean, that's a great question. So it's critical for them because this, when we look around the world, this has been the easiest and most reliable way to build partnerships, because they almost always work. If you look at China's engagement with the neighbors that it's trying to woo, Russia's engagement with Central American nations that they're trying to get close to, America's engagement with Latin America, they all realize that providing the smaller country with energy security ultimately ends up working for that smaller country, which then creates a sense of reciprocity. So the reason India wants to move towards or move along the lines of this energy security with us is because globally this has been a very, very reliable way to bring two countries together, because everybody likes energy, everybody likes electricity,
Everybody needs energy.
everybody needs it, right? So it's
Everybody needs cheap electricity.
Exactly. So it's just a very easy way to start building a strategic partnership. It's not just India. Every country now goes to their smaller neighbors and tries to build partnerships based on energy.
Thank you very much, Nilanthan, Niruthan. We'll now move to the closing statements on Face the Nation tonight. We can start off with Attorney at Law Javid Yusuf. You have 2 minutes for your closing statements and your time starts now.
Yeah, well, I don't have much to add because we've been having a fairly robust discussion, but basically, as I like to repeat, we have to leverage the goodwill that exists between India and Sri Lanka at the moment, and that is where Prime Minister Modi's visit comes into play. At least the basic positions with regard to the economy, energy and so on can be discussed, and maybe even principles laid down, but it has to be worked out in detail thereafter by the officials of both countries. And I would strongly suggest that this the fisheries dispute gets the attention it deserves because it has been neglected, and this is something which will be beneficial to both countries.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Javid Yusuf. We now move our attention to Shakthi de Silva, lecturer in international relations. Your time starts now.
Sure. So, two final issues that I'd like to talk about. One, I think there is a general consensus amongst all of us that we need to ride the Indian wave in terms of economic alignment or linking up with the Indian economy. In doing so, however, the government needs to keep in mind that transparency is quintessential. Transparency in terms of providing the public information with regard to what the MOUs consist of, as well as the long-term or medium-term implications or ramifications of them. So moving forward, I'd like to see the government taking significant efforts in terms of economic engagement with India as well as all other countries, as well as providing the Sri Lankan public the awareness necessary to prevent misinformation and disinformation from spreading as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shakthi de Silva, lecturer in international relations. Up next, Nilanthan Niruthan, director of the Center for Law and Security Studies and a defense analyst. Your time starts now.
So just 3 points: common sense, common sense, common sense. That's it.
One of the shortest closing statements we've had. Thank you very much, Nilanthan, for joining us on our program today. Finally, we have Dr. Rohantha Athukorala, and time for your closing statement starts now.
See, I think, Shalan, rather than us pushing our agenda to another country, we must ask ourselves, how can you get the world to come to us? And for that, I think we also need to ask ourselves, what is the identity of brand Sri Lanka? You know, have we thought about what is unique about Sri Lanka? How do we want to position ourselves in the minds of an Indian if we want India to come to Sri Lanka? Have we positioned ourselves as a trade partner for maybe ethical sourcing? I mean, our tea is ethically manufactured, which is endorsed by the Kyoto Protocol. Our apparel is ethically manufactured, which is also endorsed by global certification. We have now cinnamon coming in, which has got its own HS code, which differentiates from cassia. So that also can go on an ethical platform. Then we have the Ceylon sapphire. You know, we have so many things which can go on this ethical positioning platform, so that we are seen as ethical, you know. And then we also must learn to behave in that manner. You know, in that light, I love this Clean Sri Lanka campaign. You know, Clean Sri Lanka is not the campaign that goes and cleans the whole of Sri Lanka, which was what it was launched for. But it's more to do with 14 pillars. And if you really study those 14 pillars, you know, you see that you're looking at a conscious way in which Sri Lankans need to start looking at behaving. And that creates an identity. And that's what Estonia did. That's what Croatia did. So what they did was, when they decided that they, after the war in 1995, that they want to be a dominant destination, they first came out with an internal campaign like this. And then they transformed their total exports, saying quality Croatian label. They came out with the global campaign on tourism, and then it was an inward transformation that happened. It built an identity, and today, if you look at the exports of Croatia, and if you look at the tourism that it attracts, you know, it's one of the most powerful nations in Europe. So my concluding thoughts is, without pushing agendas, let's ask ourselves how we need to change, Because right now what we see on TV, when I watch MTV news, every day we get a shooting. The news starts with the shooting. What do we tell the world? How can we go and tell the world, come and do business with us, and please come and visit us, when all the news channel starts with this, and there is a underground group of people who is basically controlled from different parts of the world. So what do we tell the world? So let's ask ourselves, what is that identity that we need to create so that the world will want to come to us?
Dr. Athukorala, you're saying that we should reduce the number of shootings, not that we should stop reporting on it. Am I correct?
See, you can't stop the media. Media will always say what gets your eyeballs. And the more eyeballs that are turned on to a TV station gets you more money. So they will report the media will report the reality, but then we must ask ourselves, how do we put our place in order?
So that entails changing the reality, which is curbing the underworld.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rohantha Athukorala, for joining us on our program today. Thank you very much to also our journalists on the panel today, Mr. Nilanthan and Shihara Anis, for asking all the right questions. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in to another episode of Face the Nation. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.